Welcome to 5 Minute Bible, your daily guide for your daily reading. Today's January the 7th, and we'll be reading Job 14 through 16. Now, today's reading continues the first major dialogue cycle in the book of Job, and it presses the question of suffering even further. Job 14 through 16 remains in a patriarchal world long before the law or sacrifice or the covenant with Moses, but yet Job is still operating within covenant structures. He's relying only on his knowledge of God's character and his own lived experience to help make meaning of his trials and pain. These chapters bring Job face to face with human mortality itself and force him to ask whether hope can exist beyond the grave. Now, in chapter 14, Job reflects on the brevity and the fragility of human life. He compares man to a flower that withers and a shadow that fades. Yet he dares to ask whether death is truly the end. Job wonders aloud if a man might live again, even longing for a future moment when God would remember him, maybe even after the grave. Now, chapter 15 brings Eliphaz's second speech, and this one is harsher than the first one and even more accusatory in tone than before, insisting that Job's words prove that he is guilty. He must be unrighteous if God is allowing him to suffer this way. In chapter 16, Job responds in mortal anguish, describing his friends as miserable comforters and portraying God as the one who has torn him apart. And yet even there, Job refuses to abandon hope. As you read today, ask the question, is there hope for a righteous man? Is there hope for one who suffers beyond death? Job's suffering has stripped away all of his earthly pride and expectations. His concerns are no longer actually for the recovery or the restoration in this life alone, but he's wrestling with the fact of whether God's justice and mercy can reach beyond the grave itself. And of course, the tension in these passages is hope, struggling to breathe under the weight of our finite mortality. Job knows that death seems final and irreversible, and in his pain he feels death stalking him more than he ever has before, and yet he cannot shake the conviction that God will remember the righteous. He's crushed by the hand of God, wounded by his friends' accusations, and yet he refuses to accept that his relationship with God is going to end in abandonment. Job's language swings between despair and hope, almost like he's on a roller coaster ride, which, if you've ever been through suffering, you can know exactly what that feels like. Going back and forth between death-like feelings and then the hope of possible renewal. The tension in the text is unresolved, and intentionally so, because Job's longing in these chapters reaches far beyond what he's experiencing in suffering. It actually reaches out towards Jesus. Job asks whether a man who dies might live again, but he has no answer, only hope in the grace of God. That unanswered question will find its resolution in Jesus Christ, because he doesn't merely ask about resurrection, he accomplishes resurrection. Where Job waits for God to remember him after death, Christ is remembered by his Father through his resurrection. Where Job longs for an advocate in heaven, Christ, after his resurrection, ascends and stands there permanently as our risen intercessor. Job's suffering exposes the limits of hope without resurrection, but Christ fulfills that hope by defeating death itself, turning Job's question into the foundation of all Christian certainty. As you read Job 14 through 16 today, listen for the trembling hope beneath Job's despair. Watch how questions about death begin to give way to longing for vindication beyond this life. And that hope will soon sharpen into one of the clearest cries for a heavenly witness in the entire book. And with that, read your Bible carefully, devotionally and joyfully. May the Lord use his word to sanctify you completely, and we will continue our journey tomorrow. God bless you.